Hey, my name is Nick. I am from ETC New York, and I am here to tell you about all the new fantastic things coming into your 2.4 EOS software. So why don't you head on to the other side of the studio with me, and we'll check some of the stuff out. The first thing that's new is the board tells you what's new in the latest version of software. So there's a couple of ways we can get to this. I can say About, and in my About screen, I get a What's New button, and that's going to open up my Manual tab. The What's New area is also connected to the Help system. So for example, if I hit Help and About, I get my normal properties in my Help window, but if I look all the way down at the bottom, I now have articles that I can link straight to, and it gives me information about that specific topic. In the 2.4 release, this Help manual will represent the things that are available in the current supplements. The next thing that we've changed is we have moved where some of the config tools show up in your displays. So for example, traditionally in your color picker, in your direct selects, there has been a little gear that shows up in the upper left-hand corner, which allows you to configure those displays. As we add more and more display configurations to the desk, we wanted to simplify the location of those. So anytime you touch on a gear, you'll now get a new menu which shows up at the bottom, which allows you to configure that screen. So this is a very familiar direct select by 25 screen config. To that end, we've added some additional displays controls for some other tabs that you already know and love. For example, in my live table area, I can pop that open. And now I get a couple of different things that used to be located in setup, but now I can change on a tab-by-tab basis. One of the things I can do is suppress my target status bar, which will give me a little bit more room on tighter monitors. I can show or hide reference labels directly from this screen. I can also group channels by 5, high contrast, and change which mode my tiles will display in. And now that you have the ability to have multiple tabs of the same type open with different configurations, we give you the ability to set a default. So for example, if I set this current tab as my default, anytime I open another live table tab, it will take the properties of this as its own. And then I can modify that on an individual basis. As I make those modifications, I can reset that tab to the default, which is currently set as tab 1, or I can reset it all the way back to the EOS default. And a quick note about reference labels in particular, your About screen will display whatever your default tab setting is for show reference labels. In addition to the configuration tools that we've done in the live and blind display, we have done a lot of work in 2.4 in the PSD Display. So let's pop in and take a look at what some of those tools look like. The first thing you'll notice on the right-hand side is that we are giving you the ability to suppress or show individual columns or groupings and reorder them as well. So for example, if I wanted to hide all of my attributes or just a few of my flags, I could check those or uncheck those. If I wanted to put my label up where my queue number is, I can just move that up the list and it's going to show now right next to my queue number. On the left-hand side, there are some other tools that help you modify this display. The first is Display Master Playback Status. So in the bottom area, we show you your cues that are playing forward and the status of that through your cue ribbon. So if I hide that, that's just going to hide Master Playback Status. We can also hide the main fader ribbon, so that can go away as well to give us a little bit more space for our cues. Also in the area is the ability to display or suppress cue parts. So currently you'll notice that my Q3 is displaying its parts as it normally would. If I go ahead and hide my cue parts, you'll notice what you get is Q3 collapsed with a superscript that says 4, and that shows me how many parts that cue has. Also in this area, I can display my notes at the bottom of my screen, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. You'll also see here that I can change my display PSD time countdown. That was also previously a setup option, and now you can decide whether that's on or off on a tab-by-tab basis. Below that is a checkbox that allows you to break the link to live and blind tabs. In previous versions of software, whenever you hit live, the live tab would come to the surface, but it would also pull the playback status display to the surface. With this box checked now, anytime you hit the live button, it will leave the PSD hidden behind other tabs. If you look below that, you'll notice that you have the same default settings as your live display. And finally, at the very top of the left-hand side is your lock status. With this set to unlocked, your queue list display is going to follow your command line. If you select a queue list, that will lock that display exclusively to that list. And this replaces the functionality of the padlock in the queue list display of previous versions. In the PSD display config, we saw that I could show a notes area at the bottom of that display. And so you can see that my Q1 notes exists there. A quick way to see whether there's a note on a queue is if you look in the label column, you'll notice a little plus mark which says, I have notes attached to me. If I hover over that area, it'll show me that my note says Fiona enters upstage left. I can also point my command line to that area, and you'll notice that my notes area at the bottom of the display shows me that same note. Just like in the About screen, I can change my font size. And if I want to add a note to a queue, I can simply say Q1 attributes, which is a new soft key, and you'll notice that notes is under that soft key. And I can make my note for Q1 be top of show. And it's just as simple as that. I have one more option for displaying my notes. I can go back into my PSD displays setup, and in my columns, I now have notes. So I can add that to my display, maybe move it up right next to my label, and you'll see that those notes will show up right next to my labels. In addition to queue notes, in 2.4, we are also introducing scene breaks. Scene breaks allow you to create a visual indication in your queue list that there is a different section of the show. And there are also some tools that allow you to update and navigate in relation to scene breaks without necessarily needing to know the queue numbers. So let's take a look at some of those tools. To add a scene break, all I need to do is use my new attribute soft key under queue. So I'm going to say Q1, attributes, scene, act 1. One of the other things we can define is where a scene ends. So for example, if my Q5 is the end of that scene, I can say Q5 attributes, scene end, and that's going to give me a tag to show me that that scene is complete. Now that I have my scene 1 defined, I'm going to go ahead and post my scene 2. Qs 6, 7, and 8 are my transition, so I want Q9 through 12 to be my scene 2. So I can go ahead and say Q9 through 12, attributes, scene 2, and that is going to give me my scene 2 at the top of Q9, but it's also going to automatically give me an end of scene for Q12. Another thing that's useful is being able to make changes just through a scene without needing to know the last Q number. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Q9, and I am going to bring up 24 to full. I can now update that, and you'll notice I have a soft key now that says scene end, and that's going to automatically find the end of that scene for me. I don't have to know that Q number. But keep in mind that tracking rules still apply, so if I don't append Q only to that, that'll track past Q12. So there's also some good go-to-queue functions with scenes. Right now, my queue list is sitting in Q1, and if I want to go to the top of scene 2, I can say go to queue, and now use my scene soft key, and all the scenes that I have in my show will pop up. And if I hit scene 2, it's going to go ahead and take me right to that queue. There's one final area for scenes, and that is direct selects. So I'm going to grab a by 25 and show my scenes. And you'll notice that they show up in the tiles with the queue list and queue number listed below them. I can use these tiles to get the associated queue number onto the command line, either in blind or in live. So by hitting scene 2, you'll notice that it takes my command line to Q9 of queue list 1. The other thing I can use these scene tiles for is to make the queue that's associated with that scene pending on my queue list. So the way that I'm going to do that is just press and hold my load button for that queue list. And I'm going to go ahead and touch Q1/1. And that's going to go ahead and load that into pending for me. And that's the end of scene on scenes. Also coming into 2.4 is a function called preview mode. Preview mode allows you to compare intensity levels of the cue that you currently have on stage with either your pending cue, your previous cue, or a cue that you specify. So let's look at how to do that. On a blank command line, you'll notice that I now have a preview soft key. So I'm going to go ahead and say preview, and I get more soft keys that allow me to pick either my previous or my pending cue. So I'm going to say previous pending. And in my live channel display, you'll notice that the intensity values of the pending cue will show up. So as I move through my cues, the value below those channels will always represent the cue that's next on deck. I can also specify the cue number that I want to have in my preview area. I'm going to go ahead and say preview, Q9, enter. And now the values for Q9 are going to show up below my tombstones. Additionally, up in my display area, you'll see that it says preview Q1/9. To turn preview mode off, simply hit preview, enter. We've done a couple of quick things with shutters in 2.4. The first that you'll notice is we have frame angle and frame thrust as the nomenclature for those parameters now. So that's a quick change. The other thing is in patch, you can now change the order in which your shutters frame. So I'm going to grab my channel 111. And in my attributes area, you'll notice there's a new shutter order tile. As soon as I touch that, I get a graphic that allows me to rotate the orientation of my shutters based on how the fixture's hung, invert the order, change them back. And as soon as I hit apply, that's going to go ahead and change how those are controlled. For a long time, we have stored the state of the park buffer in the show file when you do a save. And we now give you the ability to load that park buffer when you're opening a show file. So if I come into my displays and say file open, and I'm going to pick a training, you'll notice that there's a tile down at the very bottom that is deselected by default. But as soon as I click it, it will load my park buffer upon opening the show file. So things like power channels for moving lights can be recalled when you're pulling in a new file. There is a confirm box that you have to check in order to make sure that that turns on, and you hit OK. And that will open that show file and bring in all that information. Another thing we've given a bit more granularity to in 2.4 is the ability to have separate release and off times in your setup for manual control. So I'm going to go ahead and pop into setup, and I want to go into my desk settings and my manual control. And you'll notice in my default times area, there is my assert time, which is previous to 2.4 what off time and release time we're using. But now you can see that there is a separate off time and release time. So as I use those functions with my faders, I can give them discrete times. There are also a couple of additions in the macro editor. You'll notice there's a few additional columns. The first is we can change the color of the button. So you'll notice my macro 807 is currently set to white. I can change that color to another one. So as soon as I apply that, you'll notice that my macro 807 button turns red. The other thing is that when we run a macro, we blink the button while that macro is running. So you have some indication that something is still happening. So if I go back into my macro editor and I say blink disabled, now when I run that macro, it just stays solidly lit as the macro is running. Back in the macro editor, I also now have the ability to send a macro to a specific device on my network. So I just type in that device's username, and it will fire that macro locally on that device. I also have the ability now to fire macros on a user on the network. So anybody logged into that user will have that macro fired for them. There's some details on this, so go ahead and check your literature and make sure you get those set up right. The first thing that we want to look at in the new fader config tools is the fader config window. So using our add a tab, you can see on our controls area that there's a new fader config display. This is also accessed through tab 36. The other display that is with fader config is tab 35, which is the list view. So this allows you to see all of the faders in a list view, much like all the others in the desk, and change mappings through a range or individually. So we're going to pop that open. And you'll notice a new graphical layout for how the faders get mapped. At the very top, you'll notice a fader page. There are now 100 pages of 10 faders each. And the top is also where you configure your master fader pair. So really quickly, on page 1, if I poke the top of a fader, you'll notice that I'll get a little dialog box that pops up. And the first thing that I can choose is my target. On the new fader config, I have the ability to map a cue list and a sub, just like I always have. I can map an intensity, focus color, or beam palette, a preset, or a grandmaster, like we have done before. So I'm going to go ahead and pick cue list. And then in my ID field, I can either type the cue list number that I want to appear there, or with my radio buttons on the side, I actually get a list of all of the content that currently exists. So I can very quickly pop my ID in there. Below that is whether or not this is a discrete instance, and that will determine whether or not the changes that you make affect all of the faders with this cue list mapped, or just that one instance. There's lots of information on this, so go ahead and check your supplement for more details. Next to that is your size, so you can either take up 1, 2, or 3 faders with this one piece of content. So for instance, if I pop over to 3, you'll notice now that this one piece of content is going to take up all 3 of those faders and all 6 buttons. And then finally, the button and slider configuration button allows you to select whether you're going to use the default mapping of that content, which we'll look at in some list views in a moment, or if you're going to have local mapping, which will only change on this instance of this cue list. So now that we've got some content mapped, we can do a couple of things with the faders and the buttons. If I touch on my master, I can actually change what each of these individual faders does. So for example, I can have a rate master, a down fade, or even just disable that fader. You can also customize what your buttons do. So for example, if I want that to still be my back button and that to be my go button, that's all great. Any of these buttons can be configured. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you lay out what this content does. Keep in mind that the upper left-hand most button will always be used as your load button. So on a single fader, you only have one load button on your top row. But as you spread those out, you can change what the other 2 buttons do as well. Also in the fader config, you can pop open a dialog that allows you to access the properties of the content. So for example, cue list 122, these are all of the individual properties that live with that target. So for your submasters and your cue lists, when you access anything through this dialog, you're actually changing the properties of the content, not the fader. And for a little bit more fun, I'm going to just go ahead and map a submaster, just so we can see that. So we've got sub 1. And as you can see, I can pop open and edit those sub properties as well. Like I mentioned before, you can map intensity, focus color, and beam palettes, as well as presets. So when I map any of these contents, I can still have that on the fader. However, when I access this area, these are going to be tools that reside exclusively with the fader and not with the content. So you can see there's a lot of really cool tools in here, but there's also a lot going on. So don't forget to read your supplement before diving headfirst into this tool set. Let's look at some of the sub-properties that were added in 2.4, as we saw in the fader config. So I'm just going to hop into my subs list. You'll notice that your CIA pops up with a whole bunch of options. You have your default fader config, which we'll get to in a second. And then you have all the different settings for your individual submaster. A lot of these things will look very familiar to you. Mode, master, HTP, exclusive, and restore are all the same as they've been in previous versions of software. We have made some changes to priorities though. So if you pop open the dialog box, you'll notice that there are 10 levels of priority that you can choose from, as well as shielded. Below that is background, so like in previous versions, this will allow you to determine if this target is available as a background state. And then we've also added background priority, so you have the ability to select what priority that background state has in relation to other targets that may be in the background. Just like before, you have timing that you can put on submasters, so this is where you set your up dwell and your down times. Your stomp mode determines what happens when this submaster is stomped. And what we mean by stomped is when all of the things that a target has owned have been pulled away by other targets. This allows you to determine what happens to the target when it's no longer contributing to the output of the desk. And then finally, unmark at 0. With an intensity master, as you move your fader up, it automatically marks the non-intensity parameters stored in that sub. You now have the ability to allow those non-intensity parameters to unmark as soon as the fader hits 0, rather than using the bump button. So just like all of our list views, range editing is supported with this dialog box. So for example, if I say sub 1 through 5, and I change them to LTP, that's going to go ahead and change all of those targets to latest takes precedence. So let's talk about the fader area. This area allows me to set the default button and slider properties. So whenever I map sub 1, it will automatically put these things onto the fader. So just like on my fader config, I can select what these buttons do. And once I'm happy with my config, anytime I map sub 1, the fader and button properties will be used. So it's good to know that mapping additional faders and buttons on the second and third fader slot doesn't automatically make this a 2x or a 3x fader. Instead, when you go into your fader config and open it up to a second or a third fader, we'll expose those default settings. For more information on all the new subtools that are in 2.4, don't forget to read your supplement. Let's take a look at the changes to our QList index. So I'm just going to hit QQ, and you'll notice a similar display comes up in the CIA as our sublist. And this is going to allow us to edit all the properties of each of those QLists. Your master, HTTP, and assert are the same as they have been in previous versions of software. And just like submasters now, you have the ability to set a priority, a background enabled or disabled, and a background priority. Phantom is new in 2.4, and with Phantom enabled, when you hit go on a QList, it will no longer change your selected queue, and it will no longer change an unlocked playback status display. The next two settings determine what happens when you're at the top or the bottom of a queue list. The defaults are the same as they've been in previous versions of software, so when you hit the back button from your first queue, by default you're going to go to queue out, but you now have the ability to pick whether the console does nothing, wraps back to the last queue of that queue list, or restores to the background state. Similarly, when you're going from your last queue, just like before, you would do nothing with your default setting, but you have the ability also to go to queue out, wrap it, or restore it to a background state. And just like submasters, you have a stomp mode setting, and that allows you to determine the behavior when a queue list is stomped. Also, just like submasters, in the queue list view, you're able to pick default fader and button mappings. And the final addition to 2.4 is in your QList list view, you have the number of queues that are included in each of those recorded lists. Let's take a moment to talk about the master fader in a multi-console environment. As you know, the fader pages are global. So if I map a piece of content, like a sub, to fader 2 on page 1, anywhere fader 2 on page 1 appears in a multi-console system, that sub will also appear. But we give special instances for the ability to map a queue list to your master fader in different users on the system. The important thing to remember in 2.4 is that when a new user joins a multi-console system, they won't automatically have a queue list mapped to their master fader pair. They can map that by simply saying q1/load, like previously, and then that queue list will be synchronized with any other users that have queue list 1 loaded. If you don't want those queue lists to be synced across multiple users, you can either unload the fader or use the discrete checkbox to prevent those from synchronizing. There's lots more information on this in the documentation, so be sure to read up on it before you get into production. Wow, that equipment moves fast across the studio. Thanks for checking out 2.4 with us. There are a lot of really great features that are in the desk, so be sure to read your supplement, which is conveniently inside your console now. And if you have any questions, don't forget to check out our forums, our training videos, or our fabulous support staff. I'm Nick. See you at the next one.